Peace of England, peace of Ireland, peace of every land and clime. Hearken to my joyful tidings of the golden future time.
How they toiled and sweated to get the hay in. Sometimes the work was hard. The implements had been designed for human beings and not for animals. But the pigs could think of a way round every difficulty, and the horses understood the business of mowing and raking better than Jones had ever done. The pigs did not actually work, but directed and supervised, and every animal down to the humblest worked at turning the hay and gathering it. In the end, they finished the harvest in 2 days less time than it had usually taken Jones. Moreover, it was the biggest harvest that the farm had ever seen. All through that summer the work went like clockwork. The animals were happy as they had never conceived it possible to be. With the worthless parasitical human beings gone, there was more for everyone to eat. They met with many difficulties, but the pigs with their cleverness and Boxer with his tremendous muscles always pulled them through. Boxer was the admiration of everybody. From morning to night he was pushing and pulling, always at the spot where the work was hardest. His answer to every problem was, "I will work harder," which he adopted as his personal motto. But everyone worked according to his capacity. Nobody stole, nobody grumbled over his rations. The quarrelling and biting and jealousy which had been normal features of life in the old days had almost disappeared. On Sundays there was no work. Breakfast was an hour later, and after breakfast all the animals trooped into the barn for a general assembly which was known as the meeting. Here the work of the coming week was planned out, and resolutions were put forward and debated. It was always the pigs who put forward the resolutions. The other animals understood how to vote, but could never think of any resolutions of their own. Snowball and Napoleon were by far the most active in the debates, but it was noticed that these two were never in agreement. Whatever suggestion either of them made, the other could be counted on to oppose it. The meeting always ended with the singing of Beasts of England. The pigs had set aside the harness room as a headquarters for themselves. Here, in the evenings, they studied blacksmithing, carpentry, and other necessary arts from books which they had brought out of the farmhouse. Snowball also busied himself with organizing the other animals into what he called animal committees. He formed the Egg Production Committee for the hens, the Clean Tails League for the cows, the Whiter Wool Committee for the sheep. On the whole, these projects were a failure. The reading and writing classes, however, were a great success. The dogs learned to read fairly well. Muriel the goat could read somewhat better than the dogs. Benjamin could read as well as any pig, but never exercised his faculty. So far as he knew, there was nothing worth reading. Clover learnt the alphabet, but could not put words together. Boxer could not get beyond the letter D. None of the other animals on the farm could get further than the letter A. It was found that the stupider animals such as the sheep, hens, and ducks were unable to learn the 7 commandments by heart. After much thought, Snowball declared that the 7 commandments could be reduced to a single maxim: 4 legs good, 2 legs bad. So, 4 legs good, 2 legs bad was inscribed on the end wall of the barn above the 7 commandments and in bigger letters. Napoleon took no interest in Snowball's committees. He said that the education of the young was more important, and took 9 puppies away from Jessie and Bluebell, their mothers, saying that he would make himself responsible for their education. He took them up into a loft and kept them there in such seclusion that the rest of the farm soon forgot their existence. The mystery of where the milk went to was soon cleared up. It was mixed every day into the pig's mash. The apples were now ripening, and the orchard was littered with windfalls. The animals had assumed as a matter of course that these would be shared out equally. One day, however, the order went forth that all the windfalls were to be collected for the use of the pigs. At this, some of the other animals murmured, but it was no use. All the pigs were in full agreement, even Snowball and Napoleon. Squealer was sent to make the necessary explanations. "Comrades," he cried, "you do not imagine, I hope, that we pigs are doing this in a spirit of selfishness and privilege. Many of us actually dislike milk and apples, but milk and apples contain substances absolutely necessary to the well-being of a pig. We pigs are brain workers. It is for your sake that we drink that milk and eat those apples. Do you know what would happen if we pigs failed in our duty? Jones would come back. Surely, comrades, there's no one among you who wants to see Jones come back?" Now, if there was one thing that the animals were completely certain of, it was that they did not want Jones back. So it was agreed that the milk and the apples should be reserved for the pigs alone. Most of this time Mr. Jones had spent sitting in the tap-room of the Red Lion at Willingdon, complaining of the monstrous injustice that had been done. The other farmers sympathized but did not help. Nevertheless, the owners of the two farms which adjoined Animal Farm, Foxwood and Pinchfield, were both frightened by the rebellion. Early in October, a flight of pigeons alighted in the yard of Animal Farm in the wildest excitement. Jones and all his men, with half a dozen others from Foxwood and Pinchfield, were coming up the cart track. They were all carrying sticks except Jones, who was marching ahead with a gun. Obviously they were going to attempt the recapture of the farm. This had long been expected, and all preparations had been made. Snowball, who had studied an old book of Julius Caesar's campaigns, was in charge. He gave his orders, and in a couple of minutes every animal was at his post. As the human beings approached the farm buildings, Snowball launched his attack. All the pigeons flew to and fro over the men's heads and dropped their dung, while the geese rushed out and pecked their legs. Then Muriel, Benjamin, and the sheep, with Snowball at the head of them, rushed forward and butted the men from every side. But the men were too strong, and suddenly, at a squeal from Snowball, all the animals turned and fled into the yard. The men gave a shout of triumph. They saw, as they imagined, their enemy in flight and rushed after them. This was just what Snowball had intended. As soon as they were inside the yard, the horses, the cows, and the pigs emerged in their rear, cutting them off. Snowball now gave the signal for the charge. He dashed straight for Jones, who raised his gun and fired. The pellets scored bloody streaks along Snowball's back, and a sheep dropped dead. Without halting, Snowball flung his 15 stone against Jones's legs. Jones was hurled into a pile of dung, and his gun flew out of his hands. But the most terrifying spectacle of all was Boxer, rearing up on his hind legs and striking out with his great iron-shod hooves. At the sight, several men dropped their sticks and tried to run. Panic overtook them, and the next moment all the animals together were chasing them round the yard. They were gored, kicked, bitten, trampled on. There was not an animal that did not take vengeance on them after his own fashion. The men bolted for the main road. The animals now reassembled in the wildest excitement, each recounting his own exploits at the top of his voice. The animals decided unanimously to create a military decoration, Animal Hero First Class, which was conferred then and there on Snowball and Boxer. Animal Hero Second Class was conferred posthumously on the dead sheep. There was much discussion as to what the battle should be called. In the end it was named the Battle of the Cowshed, since that was where the ambush had been sprung. In January there came bitterly hard weather. The earth was like iron, and nothing could be done in the fields. Many meetings were held in the big barn. It had come to be accepted that the pigs should decide all the questions of farm policy, though their decisions had to be ratified by a majority vote. This arrangement would have worked well enough if it had not been for the disputes between Snowball and Napoleon. These two disagreed at every point where disagreement was possible. Snowball often won over the majority by his brilliant speeches, but Napoleon was better at canvassing support for himself between times. He was especially successful with the sheep. Of late, they had taken to bleating 4 legs good, 2 legs bad, and they often interrupted the meeting with this. It was noticed that they were especially liable to break into 4 legs good, 2 legs bad at crucial moments in Snowball's speeches. Snowball was full of plans for innovations and improvements. Napoleon produced no schemes of his own, but said quietly that Snowball's would come to nothing, and seemed to be biding his time. But of all their controversies, none was so bitter as the one that took place over the windmill. In the long pasture there was a small knoll, which was the highest point on the farm. After surveying the ground, Snowball declared that this was just the place for a windmill, which could supply the farm with electrical power. This would light the stalls and warm them in winter, and would also run a circular saw, a chaff cutter, a mangle slicer, and an electric milking machine. The animals listened in astonishment while Snowball conjured up pictures of fantastic machines that would do their work for them. Within a few weeks, Snowball's plans for the windmill were fully worked out. All the animals came to look at his drawings at least once a day. Only Napoleon held aloof. He had declared himself against the windmill from the start. One day, however, he arrived unexpectedly to examine the plans. He walked heavily round, looking closely at every detail. Then suddenly he lifted his leg, urinated on the plans, and walked out without uttering a word. The whole farm was deeply divided on the windmill. Snowball maintained that it could be done in a year, and thereafter that the animals would only need to work 3 days a week. Napoleon argued that the great need of the moment was to increase food production. The question was put to the vote. The animals assembled. Snowball stood up and set out his reasons for the windmill. Then Napoleon stood up to reply. He said very quietly that the windmill was nonsense, and he advised nobody to vote for it, and promptly sat down again. At this, Snowball sprang to his feet, and shouting down the sheep, who had begun bleating again, broke into a passionate appeal in favour of the windmill. By the time he had finished speaking, there was no doubt as to which way the vote would go. But just at this moment Napoleon stood, and casting a peculiar sidelong look at Snowball, uttered a high-pitched whimper of a kind no one had ever heard him utter before. At this there was a terrible baying outside, and 9 enormous dogs wearing brass-studded collars came bounding into the barn. They dashed straight at Snowball, who only sprang from his place just in time to escape their snapping jaws. In a moment he was out of the door. Amazed and frightened, the animals crowded to watch the chase. Snowball was racing across the long pasture, the dogs close on his heels. With inches to spare, he slipped through a hole in the hedge and was seen no more.
Bill Nye was reading Animal Farm by George Orwell, abridged by Richard Hamilton and produced by Di Spears.